All righty. Hello, everyone. Welcome to May 23rd, anniversary of my graduation from college. Welcome to Dis and Dat. We're going to talk more about property today, but I'm leading off with a little piece, a very short paragraph. Well, it's actually several paragraphs, but a paragraph from the Hoover Institution, a place that Condoleezza Rice is at, among other folks, conservative folks. Quite an interesting little quote, and it is the fundamental issue, I think, that socialism presents to some people, or communism might present to some people, and it is what some people, sort of accuse Marx of taking away your stuff, or communism would take away your stuff. And I think it's really important to figure out that personal property is not the same as private property. And it's just a rethinking about what constitutes the public. And for example, American public utilities are not really quite public in most cases. The institution of this is from the Hoover Institution. The institution of the right to private property is perhaps the single most important condition for a society in which freedom, including free trade, is to flourish. There's no mystery about why Karl Marx put the abolition of private property at the top of his list of revolutionary changes leading to his communist utopia. Under communism, we are all deemed to be one. Privacy has no place in a system that holds, as Marx proclaimed, that, quote, the human essence is the true collectivity of man, unquote. Privacy is ruled out by definition. Stealing, robbery, burglary, embezzlement, trespassing, not to mention borrowing, bequeathing, giving, and the like, are precluded, where everything is the property of everyone, all at once. Rather, nothing would be untoward except the failure to share, to distribute fairly what is needed, or to yield to a government mandating such distribution. However, if we are fundamentally individuals, then communism is not right for us, and the system of private property rights could well be the best system of political economy for human beings. A libertarian theory of justice must address whether the strong prohibition against any kind of involuntary redistribution of privately owned wealth can be justified. It will be helpful, therefore, to explore what may be a somewhat novel defense of private property rights as understood within the framework of classical liberal political economy. Generally, the prohibition against any form of involuntary redistribution of wealth rests on the existence of a basic human right to private property. So you can sort of see where the Hoover Institution is coming from, a kind of libertarian point of view, one that I would assert that the current Libertarian Party of the United States does not follow. And in fact, as I've mentioned before, Donald Trump is going to address the Libertarian Party's convention soon. I hope to watch it on C-SPAN. C-SPAN normally does show. They rarely show left party conventions. They always show right-wing party conventions. So if you want to know where C-SPAN is coming from, it is on those terms. Although the Libertarian, I would assert to you the Libertarian Party is actually a fun convention to watch, just because it attracts. Not simply because of what I just mentioned there, this kind of absolute right to private property and sort of the resistance to a massive, to the oppressive deep state, etc. But it's just fun. They just, you can see people who are nuts, who all are kind of in the same weird place, and not an accordion in sight, although I would expect there would be accordion. So from a different point of view, this is from an author, the Chinese Academy. It has been fashionable to say in the last 10 years, this was written in 2008 in China, that Coase, that's Ronald Coase, has a theory of property rights, but Marx does not. Some even maintain that one cannot even find the term property rights in Marx's works. That's not true, but I wanted to show three things today because it's about toothbrushes in some ways, and I think that's probably it's unfortunate that it is now a trope, at least in some socialist videos, but it is, I think, one of the better or more pithy examples of what counts as the difference between private property and personal property. So I have three little videos. They're short. They're each short. So we'll just see if we can get through them.
Too often I've seen people talk about the radical left wanting to abolish private property.
They just told me up there they don't care about private property, they will destroy it.
Abolition of private property, you know, that thing that is essential to the fundamental bulwark of freedom.
I love that Antifa just has an absolute respect for people's rights and their private property.
And this is true, but it's not being used in the same way of what is traditionally viewed, which leads to, of course, some understandable confusion. So here's how a socialist such as myself defines it. Bear in mind this all works around the parameters of the capitalist system that we live in. Private property is property which is used to accumulate profit. This can include such examples: a road, a limousine, a railroad, a factory, a restaurant, a production studio, a forest, a lake, oh hell, a mountain. So now we must ask, what is personal property? Personal property is, to put it simply, the things you own, including your house, your car, your camera, your TV, your computer, your bed, your oven, and yes, your toothbrush. But it's worth bearing in mind there is no specific list, so to speak. All these things can technically be used for private profit-making devices, but if you own them individually or as a group for the purposes of use, then no person has a problem with this. The problem arises when the social condition of said property starts depriving people of it for use in the market economy, otherwise known as antagonism. You may ask, but don't they deserve such property, seeing as, you know, they earned it? No! The relations of private property are entrenched in violence and enclosure. The commons formerly used for the way of free access were gradually churned away through legal acts or via violent revolution by merchants. As an experiment, go talk to a capitalist and ask him how he came to garner such property. Then ask him how his forebearers came to garner it. And when they eventually come to the end, they should tell you that it was probably garnered by violence, in which case, challenge him to a duel. Now this can raise some problematic situations, so for example, what if somebody owned 1,000 acres of land and used it entirely for the purposes of leisure, without making any money off of it? Well, then you might need to ask, how on earth is somebody supporting 1,000 acres of land without putting it to any use? And probably what comes of this is that they are exploiting profit in other ways to supplement this, in which case you need to ask them whether or not they can justify 1,000 acres of land simply for their own personal leisure, or can it be put to a better measure? Now obviously no individual can constantly own a railway for personal use, which is why there's a third type of property, collective property, whereby it is owned by a group or and for society at large. The end goal of this is our belief that private property should be transferred over to the workers' use so that it can be used collectively for a common good, specifically the means of production, or basically how everything comes to be created in the first place for process in the economy, and in many leftist minds to later be used in conjunction with a revolution of sorts to transfer over into communism. There are of course many nuances that come with this question, such as occupancy and use, but this video isn't going to go into the detail of such things, merely describing the basic principles of private versus personal. If you want to find out more about the nuances, I suggest you go to Reddit or Anarchist FAQ. So in summary, we want their property, we don't want yours. Apart from Sargon's.
Yes, apart from Sargon. Video number 2.
Now, I can't actually see you given that this is YouTube and all, so you could be wearing a tuxedo or you could be wearing nothing at all. Stupid sexy Flanders. But bear with me on this one so we can play out this scenario. I'm going to assume that you, my very attractive friend, are wearing a hat. But not just any hat. Naturally, I'm extremely jealous and want one of my own. Nice hat, I tell you. How much are you going to sell it to me for? To which you respond very reasonably, like a normal person would. Back off, Paul. This is my personal property. I'm not selling this. This hat is to be used, not exchanged. Take that commodity trade nonsense elsewhere. As you can imagine, I'm understandably heartbroken at having been shut down like that, and I run home with my tail between my legs. All dreams of ever owning such a beautiful hat like that myself, having been crushed by your cruel, cruel words. But on the way back, I pass by a shop and I see that very same beautiful hat in the window. Excited, I run inside and I pick it up. But the shop owner's alarmed and sternly warns me, "Put that hat down, it's the company's private property. If you want it, you're gonna have to pay for it." Now, naturally, I'm baffled. I was assured that this beautiful hat was personal property that was meant to be used. Now I'm being told that it's private property, that if I want access to its warm embrace, then I'm gonna have to exchange money for it. How can it be that the purpose of this beautiful hat for you is use, while for the shop owner its purpose is exchange? That it can be either personal property or private property depending on who owns it and what they're doing with it. Well, let's get to the bottom of this. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. So, we've run into a little bit of difficulty here. This beautiful hat seems to be both personal property and private property. It has use value in its usefulness as a protector of my head against the cruelty of the wind and the rain, but it also has exchange value in that it can be exchanged for a certain price on the market. Well, in fact, this is one of the most basic building blocks of the capitalist system, the commodity. And the key feature of commodities is that they possess both use value and exchange value. They can be both personal property and private property. However, they're produced primarily for exchange, as private property to make profits for capitalists, and secondarily produced for use, to become personal property. This goes for all commodities produced under the capitalist mode of production, from food to clothes to, you guessed it, Nintendo. If you look at the place you're living right now, whether that's an apartment, a house, or anything else, for you this has use value or usefulness. For you, it's shelter. It keeps you warm, protected. You get to relax with friends and family, get drunk, talk socialism, etc. But your home likely wasn't created primarily for that purpose. It was created primarily to be the private property of the bourgeoisie that would be exchanged and make them more money. Okay, so now we can see that there's a fundamental difference emerging between how the working class engages with personal property, your home as a place to live, and how the capitalist bourgeoisie engages with private property, that home they acquired solely to make profit. In fact, let's take a moment to clearly map out these differences. In the last video, we talked a little bit about labour power. Now this is also a commodity in that it possesses both use value in its ability to produce, as well as exchange value as capitalists purchase it from us for a certain price in the forms of wages and salaries. For most working class people, we sell our labour power, or commodity, C, to bosses. In return for this, our bosses give us a little bit of money, M. We then take this money that we receive from our wage or salary and use that to purchase commodities, C, for us to use, like food, clothes, toothbrushes, etc. This is the CMC circuit that the working class engages in. We have our commodity, labour power, that we sell for money, and with that money we purchase more commodities. CMC. Capitalists, on the other hand, operate not just on a CMC circuit, but on an inverted MCM circuit. The capitalist circuit begins with money, M, which they use to purchase commodities, C, primarily labour power, in order to get back more money, M. And importantly, that final M includes the initial sum of money invested plus profit that has been generated through labour power. We can signify the presence of this added profit with M prime. Capitalists can then take this profit and use it to purchase more commodities, to get even more profit, to purchase even more commodities, and so on and so on. Okay, take a moment to give yourself an little pat on the back because you've just learned the general formula of capital, MCM. Now, this is the simplified version of the capitalist circuit. There are a few more steps in between that we'll return to in a later video. But we can already see from this that the proletariat on the CMC circuit and the bourgeoisie on the MCM circuit interact quite differently with property. The proletariat acquires personal property exclusively for us to use. The bourgeoisie acquires private property for exchange in order to make profits. Communists seek to abolish private property, not personal property. We seek to abolish exchange value and instead produce entirely for use. To, as the old saying goes, abolish the commodity form. Now, onto the ever-pressing question of toothbrushes. Yes, you get to keep your feckin' toothbrush for personal use. But if there are capitalists who are producing them for profit, for exchange, then you better believe that we're going to hunt them down and redistribute those toothbrushes for the good of the people. The people's toothbrushes. Today we've looked at the differences between personal property and private property. As a general rule, personal property is that property that we possess in order to use value. Private property, on the other hand, is property that's possessed for the purpose of making profits, exchange value. We've also mapped out the ways in which workers and capitalists relate to commodities, either on the proletarian CMC circuit or the bourgeois MCM circuit, which is the general formula of capital. Next up, that burning question of our time, what is capitalism? Thank you for watching this video, hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. For more on housing and the question of use value,
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Sign up at the link below and get free access to Nebula, where you can watch my original series, The New F Word. Episode 2 is available right now. Socialism is great until you run out of other people's money. Socialists just want everything given to them for free. Socialists want to take your stuff. How many times have you heard all these claims? Probably a lot. While it can be frustrating to have to debunk these misguided arguments over and over again, a lot of the people making them have never had it explained to them. In the United States in particular, the legacy of the Red Scare and McCarthyism has left us with a heavily propagandized version of history and economics. So for this video, I thought we'd take a few minutes and look at one of the more common objections to socialism. The idea that socialists just want to take your stuff. For those of you watching, wherever you place yourself on the political spectrum, I hope this episode will shed some light on what socialism is really about. When we're all on the same page about our goals for the future, we can actually have a productive conversation. So, why do some people think that socialists want to take your stuff? This claim likely stems from a line in the Communist Manifesto, in which Marx writes, "In this sense, the theory of the communist may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property." The outrage produced by this line is simply the result of a misunderstanding of the concept of private property. A lot of people hear the term private property and think, oh, like my toothbrush, or my guitar, or my life-size Snorlax plush. And while their confusion is understandable, that's not what socialists mean by private property. Your toothbrush and all your other belongings are considered personal property. Think of it as stuff you own, occupy, or otherwise use on a daily basis. Your clothes, your car, your furniture, even big things like your house, if you've paid it off, of course. Otherwise, it's technically owned by the bank. If we somehow magically flipped the socialism switch overnight, no one would come to repo your stuff. I promise none of us want to share the people's toothbrush. Private property, often referred to as the means of production, is defined as something which generates capital for the person or firm which owns it. Think big business. Oil rigs, hotels, factories, agricultural land, restaurant chains, big box stores, things which produce profits for the person whose name is on the important paperwork. This private property is owned by one person, a capitalist, or a family in the case of something like Walmart, but is tended by workers. People who have no say in the overall operation, and trade their time and labor for a wage. This wage is always less than the value they produce for the company, and this surplus value is what generates profits for the capitalists. Okay, that should be a pretty clear distinction, but if you're still struggling a little bit, let's take a concrete example. We're all familiar with Henry Ford. founder of the Ford Motor Company, business magnate, and pretty terrible person, but that's beside the point. Henry Ford was a capitalist. He owned private property, the means of production, something that produced capital, his car factories. He also, presumably, had plenty of personal property, things which he himself used on a daily basis. That personal stuff, his pocket watch, his top hat, his car, a Ford of course, all of these things would still be his in a socialist society, because he actually personally uses them. The only thing that would be taken from him, and there's some nuance to this, we'll get to that, would be his car factories. The stuff he owns in name, but is run by workers. Alright, with these definitions and a real-life example, you should now have a pretty good grasp on what the distinction is between personal and private property. The next question you might have is, well, why do socialists want to take this private property? That's a good question, but it's subtly worded in a way that makes socialists seem like the bad guys. Let's imagine a scenario. You and 10 of your friends are working on a farm. Every day you get up, tend the fields, feed the animals, maintain the equipment, and so on. Without your labor, the farm would not produce anything. Now imagine that once a month, some fancy city slicker comes to stand in the field and watch y'all work for 20 minutes, and then he goes away again. In this scenario, who is producing value? You and your friends are. The workers. The people who actually do the work of farming. But you don't own the things you produce, nor do you own the tools, or the animals, or the barn, or the fields. Those are all owned by the guy who shows up once a month. And that's a generous estimate, as I'm sure you know. It doesn't seem right that the guy who's never there, who never picks up a shovel or plants a single seed, has complete control of the farm and pockets all the profits himself. When socialists say they want to seize the means of production, it's not that they want to take the farm from the city slicker, they want to give the farm to the farmers, to the people who actually do the work. No one is entitled to the value generated by others, which, ironically, is how people swindled by capitalist propaganda see socialism. They think, oh, those socialists are just lazy and want to benefit from the hard work of others. That couldn't be further from the truth. Socialists recognize who's doing the hard work, and they want to return the fruits of that labor to those people. It's as simple as that. Now, as always happens with topics where you're starting from square one, I'm sure this explanation has brought up even more questions. But I hope that so far I've been able to articulate the philosophy of socialism. The means of production should be held in common, not hoarded by people who simply have the money to hold the piece of paper which says they own the property. Let's quickly tackle one more common question about ownership of private property before looking at the real threat to your personal property. One of the most common questions a socialist will get from a curious layperson is, what about small business owners? What happens to my dad's pizza place? And once again, good question. It's hard to give a blanket answer to things like this for a number of reasons. One of them being that socialism is a process. The end goal of a stateless, classless, moneyless society is a long way off, and there will be many phases along the way. But to give you a general answer that I hope is at least somewhat useful, if your dad pays his employees fairly, if he's not exploiting their labor for greater profits, if he operates just one restaurant in your community, and if he does some of the work himself, he's probably fine for now. Would it be better if the employees received the full value of their labor and had democratic control of their workplace? Absolutely. If that were the case, they might even choose to democratically elect the former owner as the operations leader of the team.
I'm Amber Binsbox, creator and co-founder of LTK, the first and largest creator community. LTK.
There are all but generally speaking, what socialists believe should happen is that workers should have a say in their work. And that doesn't sound unreasonable to me. If you've ever worked in a big box store, I'm sure you share the common opinion that workers have a far better grasp on running the day-to-day operations of the store than the managers do. And the higher up the chain you go, the more that's the case. Put a CEO in a Starbucks store during the morning rush, and they'll be curled up in a little ball in 20 minutes flat. Okay, we've talked about how socialists don't want to take your stuff, and in fact want to give you back more control over your work and your financial well-being. But you might still be on the fence about whether it's a better option than capitalism. So, let's talk about property under capitalism. Over the last several decades, as labor protections have been rolled back, unions have been gutted, and rampant privatization has consumed more and more of our reality, conditions for the average worker have worsened. Wages are stagnant at best, and not even close to keeping up with inflation. For example, if the federal minimum wage had just kept up with inflation and productivity gains over that period, it would be over $24 an hour right now. It's currently $7.25, just over a quarter of what it should be. But wages aren't the only issue. The cost of living has skyrocketed. Everything from food to healthcare to education, and especially housing, has become monumentally more expensive. It is now impossible for a worker earning the prevailing state or federal minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any for the necessities. Private capital has stepped in to offer a deal. A very bad one. If you can't afford a home, just take out a loan. Need a new car, or heck, even a used one at this point? Financing is available. Just don't read the fine print. Things have gotten so bad in the United States that you can now finance a pizza in case the cost is too much. So when we're talking about personal property, your car, your house, your cell phone, for more and more people, you don't own those things at all. The bank does. And if you make one wrong move, if your boss decides you're redundant and lets you go and you can't pay your installment, those things will be taken from you, leaving you destitute and without a safety net. Under capitalism, there's no such thing as workplace democracy. The city slicker owns the farm. If you step out of line, you're gone, replaced with another desperate cog ready to be plugged into the machine. And since you do not have access to the means of production, the only thing you have to bargain with is your labor. Either you sell that labor to a capitalist firm in exchange for a meager wage, or you starve. There is no freedom in this arrangement. The entire capitalist system is built on coercion. But capitalism isn't just lethal to workers, it's lethal to itself. As capitalists trim more and more fat from their expenses, as they slash employee pay, stop offering benefits, and attempt to run the leanest operation possible, they're shooting themselves in the foot. What happens when the worker who produces TVs can no longer afford the very product their labor created? The capitalist system is built on consumption. Without people to buy the products workers produce, the economy grinds to a halt, sparking fear in the capitalists who react by trying to cut expenses even further to ensure their profits. There will come a breaking point. The contradictions inherent to the capitalist system, including the primary one, labor versus capital, will eventually lead to the collapse of the suicidal system that puts profit over all else. Every once in a while, a war will be fabricated to give capitalism a shot in the arm and the stamina to keep limping along another decade or two. But eventually, even this effort will fail, and the choice then will be socialism or barbarism. If you ask socialists, we'd say we're getting pretty close to that point. Okay, I know that last section was a bit doom and gloom, but it's really important to understand that not only do socialists not want to take your stuff, capitalists do. They want to squeeze every last drop of value out of you and then cast you aside when you're no longer profitable. And you know what? We can't really even blame them. They're as much a slave to this system as we are. They just happen to have a lot more power. But even with that power over 99% of the population, if the owner class doesn't play the capitalist game of cost-cutting and profit maximizing, they will be consumed by the players that do. Eventually, this leads to Disney owning everything and all of us living in massive company towns and getting paid in Mickey bucks. Not a very pleasant future. As one final consideration, think about the things you own. Your personal property. How much of it do you have to replace way too often? Under capitalism, due to the need for affordable goods that can be purchased on a worker's wage, we've seen an explosion of cheap, poorly made items and pieces of technology that are designed to fail or are only repairable by specific people or companies. Capitalism encourages sweatshop labor to produce fast fashion, imported in bulk and thrown away after a season of use. Capitalism bricks phones with mandatory updates after a few years, artificially diminishing their battery life or making features inoperable. The average person can no longer work on their car. They have to take it to a shop with specialized equipment. Even heavy machinery like tractors have proprietary software that makes it impossible to fix on your own. John Deere operators just finally won a years-long crusade to be able to fix the tractors that they paid for and supposedly own. I've used this anecdote before, but I have a friend who has a 40-year-old Soviet hairdryer that's still working just as well as the day their dad got it. That is the difference between the goals of socialism and capitalism. Under capitalism, you don't really own anything. You rent your home and your car from the bank, your phone is tied to a provider's plan, your car has been made artificially difficult to access, farmers literally have to hack their tractors to be able to work on them. That seems real smart, by the way. Oh, you're trying to grow food so our population doesn't starve? Gotta pay me to unlock the software first. Under socialism, none of this would be allowed to continue. You'd have the right to repair the things you own. We'd see a massive proliferation of open source software. Products would be designed to last because the profit motive has been done away with. You could actually own quality personal property. When you lay out the facts like this, when you really weigh what's important and which system values human flourishing, it's clear that socialism wins hands down, every time. And while there's so much more to talk about, this video was nominally about answering the question of whether socialists want to take your stuff. I hope it's clear by now that we do not. In fact, we want to empower you to have more control over your stuff, including the most important things, your work and your livelihood. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'll probably do a series on these common objections to socialism, so be
Come on. There we go. So I just like the, is anyone there? Yes? Hello? I like the toothbrush business that you can't, you really shouldn't be sharing toothbrushes anyway, regardless. It's actually bad for you, potentially unhealthy or unhygienic. But even in the sharing toothbrush issue, in an article, a British article that suggests that you shouldn't be sharing your toothbrush, the primary benefit of sharing an electric toothbrush is the reduced cost. When you break down the cost of ownership of an electric toothbrush to be used by two people rather than one, the cost comes down because of, replaceable heads. Yes. In most cases, this is almost half because the cost is now split two ways. Now, that's a very simplistic example, and but you can see the analogy further off. It's the heads that are important, and the length, in fact, is important. With replaceable heads, you can't use them manually. It's very difficult to use them manually. Anyway.
And?
Yes?
Is it okay to share dental floss?
Depends where it's been, John.
Only in Montana. Only in Montana. But anyway, I don't know how much time I have left. No, I don't have any time left. We can have this discussion perhaps in tomorrow's this and that. I included some other stuff here that talks about the question of private property and the idea that, of course, there's a difference between personal property, which is your stuff, most of your stuff, and then private property, which, is fungible in many ways. Anyway, this is this idea of property right structures, and I think it's important to think about these questions. I included a section from the Stanford philosophy site on some of these issues. Modern property rights scholars are methodological individualists. It's a big word, but it is often the way in which, and in fact, it's the critique of analytic Marxism is that it focuses more on methodological individualism. That is, it's not so much about your stuff, but it overemphasizes the individual as opposed to a class. And that's just it's a straw argument. But frankly, a lot of Orthodox Marxists are really quite irritated with analytic Marxism and insist that, well, you're not talking about class, blah, 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 blah. There's no class struggle, blah, blah, blah. No, there is, that's the whole point of this business here, is that it's the essence of it, in fact, to have people take your stuff. Anyway, they view the capitalist community as a voluntary association of utility-seeking individuals. I actually made that argument when I was on jury duty. I said, the complainant or the victim actually has a right not to be associated with her attacker. Anyway, so that didn't go over well in the jury, but anyway, it was a hung jury at the end. And so Marx viewed the process of social change as occurring in a series of historically predetermined discontinuous sequences. This whole business about, remember I talked about nested circuits and, the kind of ugliness that, and in fact, chaotic, the whole question of crisis is built on the predetermined discontinuous sequences. Anyway, anyway, there's a length of things yacked on in the right to private property done by the Hoover Institution, and then on the other Stanford page, Hoover Institution is at Stanford. This is from the Stanford philosophy page. It has a summary in the section on property that goes from Aristotle to Aquinas, and essentially moving about the same thing, but it is adding on, or a layering, as it were, questions of moral obligations. And in fact, you can see the class struggle embedded in Aquinas. Not only do the rich have moral obligations to act generously, but the poor also have rights against the rich. And this is even before capitalism. And then a discussion of Hobbes and Hume and Locke about whether it is a natural right or not. And it's an interesting question because that's where natural rights always sort of evolved from, is in a sort of pre-modern state. Anyway, and of course, the question of the state of nature, which I think in the modern period, as we've seen, is not quite the same deal. And anyway, and I won't go at great length about Locke. I'll leave that to others. So anyway, Kant is also involved here because he's sort of riffing on Locke in the sense that there is a general connection between property and agency, maintaining that there would be an affront to agency and thus to human personality if some system were not arrived at, which could permit useful objects to be used. Since the appropriation of a resource as private property affects everyone's position, that is, imposing duties on them that they would otherwise not have, it cannot acquire full legitimacy by unilateral action. It must be ratified by an arrangement which respects everyone's interests in this matter. This is this whole social contract thing that is still necessary. That is, external objects can be used as property, also requires them to enter into a civil constitution. This is that social contract business. And so when Hegel is writing, it is this idea of trying to juxtapose freedom that can be incorporated, but it is this question of rationality and also the greater good. So by the time we get to Marx, this private property question should have been understood, and the question of cooperation, cooperative labor is important. And without going into a great deal of rigmarole about John Stuart Mill, etc., I think it's important to note, as was noted in the three videos, this problem of rent seeking or the rent creation, the formation in the same period that we have Aquinas, etc., English land laws being occurring and organized in such a way as an extension of religion, ostensibly, as well as the feudal mode of production, as controlling a lot of these things and raising into questions what are in fact universal property rights or universalized property rights. So it is this idea of reconstructing. Marx used a completely new proletarian world outlook to construct the main body of the theoretical edifice of property rights. The point being here is that property rights is, in fact, a theoretical edifice, a theoretical construction. And this is from that article that I quoted from earlier about sort of thinking about a Chinese point of view. And to close, this is just the last bit of the abstract. The changing direction from passive sublation to active sublation revealed by Marx clearly shows the historical inevitability and long-term developmental trend of the substitution of public economic and judicial relations for the capitalist relations of production and system of property rights. And that's all I can yak about for today. I added two little short videos on what is the question of private property. Can it be in fact eliminated? And it's of course always a proposition about moving towards a kind of socialism that at least addresses some of these differential issues and the problematic issues of private property. In fact, that essentially creates violence. That is, property is theft, to go back to various parties from the 18th and 19th century. Okay, I'm done. You can talk now.
Okay, two questions.
Sure.
From a historical perspective, did this conflation of personal and private property precede Marx?
Produce what? I'm sorry.
Was it conflated, the argument of abolishing private property,
Yes.
not personal property? Was that a conflation? Was this an issue prior to Marx's Capital?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think the issue is the movement from the difference between primitive communism and slavery. In slavery, you don't own yourself,
And
I mean,
so has it
somebody
always
else's
been
private
conflated
property.
as well?
Go ahead.
Has the concept of the communists or the socialists want to come and take your stuff always conflating personal and private property? Has that always been like that?
Yeah.
Is it-
I would assert to you that it's always like that. That is, and it is what creates class divisions, isn't it? Right? The difference between the property of the king versus the property of my stuff or my rights. And it is always this question, not so much of the property itself, but of the right to the property, which is how.
I think I asked my question wrong.
Oh.
More wondering, has there always been a confusion between those two on purpose? Purposely misunderstanding the argument or the justification against private property by the people who are against socialism or communism?
No, you could say that it's just rationalizing power. I mean, you could see this, in pre-feudal times. The business in the Bible about, render unto Caesar, etc., as opposed to rendering unto, God, right? The difference between the secular and the religious, it's just simply a kind of division on that basis. In other words, if you step onto church property, you get to declare a right of asylum, right? You get to have yourself back. Right? I mean, the idea of sanctuary, some people still retain that, right? If you go and, I mean, in some places, you could claim that. Not in, currently, probably not, but, I think there are probably some places where that might be actually, possible.
Not in Palestine at the moment.
No. And in fact, the argument that is used by pro-Zionists is that, the Palestinians have no right of return. And, they're not stateless. They truly are not stateless. There was a Palestinian state before there was an Israeli state. I mean, some people have to get over this, that there was a Palestinian state prior to the Israeli state. And, you sort of have to acknowledge that. You can't erase history. The remaining question, of course, is, can you have two states? And why can't there be two states? or what is preventing them from having two states? Well, one side would say, well, they don't deserve that one state for X number of weird reasons, right? Just as it is from the other side. But it's not, this is not a whataboutism kind of argument. This is just simply that, what's equitable in this particular case is that, there was originally a division, and one side has been totally stealing shit from the other side for the last 70 and some odd years.
That kind of leads to my question. If you don't mind,
Sure.
when I see this, understand this notion that private property is, essentially comes at some cost to everybody else, that, most people, when they encounter that, would be like, oh shit, capitalism is broken, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, why don't more people come to that realization? And maybe it is because of this confusion, or, it's like sometimes people think when you say private property, you're talking about their shit,
Right. That's the misunderstanding of it. And of course, the good fences make good neighbors theory, right?
Yeah.
And good fences make good neighbors until you go down to the the city clerk.
Or you put your boombox next to the fence, right?
Well, that's it. That is the kind of issue there. You're right to have unnoisy air space. But noise ordinances work like that, don't they? Actually, it's only idiots who would get out there with their microphones and try to measure the decibel level.
When I lived in San Leandro, the house was built in 1927, and so it had, the building codes were different, and so like the garages were right on the property line. There was no offset.
Right, absolutely.
Are you calling me an idiot, Hanley?
And my neighbor,
I've been doing that very thing recently. Listening to the birds, whacking it up to,
Oh yeah.
testing the old decibels.
Or birds.
yeah, I had a neighbor, I worked from home occasionally then, and I had a neighbor who had a drum kit that he practiced in his garage, which was right next to right next to my house.
I play guitar a lot, right? Sometimes amped up. I try to make sure everybody's like away, like at work or whatever. And I ask, I'm not annoying you with a guitar, am I? Whenever I see them in the street. And they say no, but their eyes don't. Like I wish they'd just say yes. Because I feel guilty every time I play. All you've got to do if it's too loud is come and tell us. So, no, it's all right, man. No, it's all right, it's all right. It's all right, man, it's all right. I'm like, no, I don't know.
I mean, the problem occurs with common goods, that is, property rights to certain things that are more invisible, like air quality, electromagnetic spectrum, water.
Well, I definitely exude a lot of magnetism. So that's bound to be fucking up their chakras. You know what I mean?
Well, I would assert that, I mean, one of the reasons why we have, administrative, the ITU and the FCC is to ensure that in an emergency, communication is not interfered with.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Titanic. Anybody else?
Just going to the question of the two-state solution for Israel. I mean, the reason that's not going to work is I cannot see Israel giving the Palestinians an actual state that is capable of self-determination and sovereignty, to determine their own foreign policy, trade, security, etc.
Well, why shouldn't they? They were given that at the beginning.
Who was given that?
The Palestinians. There were essentially two states at the beginning. The 48 or 49, whatever it is, whatever determination, they were almost two states of almost equal size. It's just that for other idiotic reasons, one was divided into two pieces, which was totally stupid.
I mean, would that state be viable just in terms of?
Well, the way it's designed, it was designed in the original. I assume that it was designed not to be equitable. The way that it should have been equitable is to give in the original design, to give the northern part to the Palestinians and the southern part to the Israeli. I think they could have lived with that, right? From Tel Aviv down would have been a perfect, I don't think it would have been an unreasonable Jewish state. Let's put it that way.
Well, the Balfour Declaration said basically don't harm the Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it was perfect at the beginning. I'm just saying that the way they designed it originally was problematic.
Yeah, I'm saying the Balfour Declaration was a lot better than what it was.
Yes,
It's
I agree
basically
with you.
saying,
I agree
we'll
with you.
set this up providing you don't fuck over the people who already live there. And
Exactly.
what did they go and do?
There was a series of agreements, and with all due respect, somebody welched on the agreement. And then this whole business for the last 20, 30 years or whatever, 40 years maybe, of, intruding on, Palestinian property has always been problematic. Well, I mean, it got screwed up, from 67, blah, blah. And, I don't want to go over the whole history, but it just seems to me at some point, from an international point of view, someone in a post-colonial point of view just stepped in and say, here's your two states, love it or leave it.
But that's like, the UN, the frowned at the UN suggesting stuff like that for fucking decades, haven't they?
Oh, I know. I mean, it was the same problem with Korea, Vietnam. I mean, this shit has been going on for a long time, and it's unfortunate that some people, because they think, oh well, we got to recognize these rights or those rights or blah blah blah, and then you have wars, and then it's really only within some people's lifetimes that we've had international organizations that can at least talk about this. Now, whether anything gets done is a whole nother thing, because we're at war right now, or there is a war. There's several wars right now.
Prior to Balfour, there was possibility for binational states, but the problem was white racist settlers coming with ideology that would prevent any possibility of that ever happening.
Well, ultimately,
and which continues to rule the Israeli state. One of the most idiotic things I remember from the Oslo period were this whole issue of, what is the definition of a Palestinian state? How would that look? And where you have the West Bank and Gaza over here. They were talking about erecting land bridges, essentially a huge super freeway connecting the southern West Bank to Gaza, not touching uh, Israel proper. Ridiculous notions like that.
Yep.
It's such a small place, and they're so interlinked that binational, one state, one person, one vote is the
Oh,
likely
by the way,
outcome, just
condolences, Joe.
like South Africa.
You've got my condolences, Joe. I forgot to mention
Hmm.
the Israeli ambassador has been withdrawn from Norway.
Ah, sad loss.
I was
You're
thinking
gonna
a bit,
miss
Joe.
him.
Fucking
And
gutted.
Spain
Yes, and Ireland.
and Ireland.
Yes.
Yeah, somewhat positive development.
Like, wow, Joe will be mortified who says this.
I mean, I'm not saying that it's a simple solution, but I think that, they managed to do a partition, not very well, of course, between India and Pakistan. I mean, that took nearly 20 years to figure out, but it's the same problem, a nearly identical problem, actually. Of course, I'm sure people from South Asia would not say that it's the same problem, but I see it as the same damn problem.
Yeah, you could say the South African problem is not the same problem. Everything is unique, but they are very similar.
Oh, they
They're more
absolutely
similar
are.
than not.
Well, I mean, in the South African case, it was clearly just an extension of the original colonialism. It was just, and then they suddenly built an entire ideology behind it, a racist ideology behind it, and that went on for decades.
You might want to mute as I can't reach my phone. And Coco's licking me face off and I can't stop laughing. You might have
Should I
to
kill
mute.
YouTube?
Coco treats, Coco treats.
He won't stop us. I don't reach the phone.
Treats, Coco treats.
Oh God, I'm covered in fucking slapper. Scruffy little Herbert. Oh God, I'm claggy. You just had a drink of
Ryan, you
water
want
as
to
well.
close out the show?
Yeah. Fuck.
I think you can cut the recording now, Joe.
All right. Do you want to close it out?
Yeah, I guess so. Well, we could switch to talking about how inequitable dog saliva is. I don't know. Ooh.